In firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. For over 20 years, the FireStore has equipped first responders with trusted gear featuring brands like MSA Carnes for helmets and Seek for thermal imaging cameras. Stay prepared. Visit thefirestore.com today. The FireStore, your trusted safety partner.
United Safety's Valor First Responder solutions are built for those who protect us. With durable, ergonomic seating for fire trucks and ambulances, advanced air purification to reduce airborne risks, and a dependable vehicle brake lock for added safety on the job, we provide solutions that keep first responders ready and protected. Valor First Responder Solutions, designed for the demands of the front line.
Hi, Chris McClune here with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Welcome to this episode of our Water Delivery Podcast. As usual, I've got Andy Soccodato and Bill Adkins here with me. And we're going to do it a little differently today. After our last episode, we were kicking around ideas about how to round out the year with the podcast. And we decided that Bill and Andy would send me some photos that they've taken throughout the year. You have to remember, Bill and Andy get around during the year. They do a lot of training throughout the year. So during those trainings, they take a number of pictures. So they picked out some of the best that they wanted to share with all of you. And we're basically going to just talk about what we're looking at in the pictures. In fact, I expect that probably Andy and Bill just probably start having conversations amongst themselves as we look at these. As we go through them. So without further ado, let's just get started. Guys, thanks again for joining me as usual. We're going to start with one that Andy sent first. So here we go. Andy, what are we looking at here? You know, I mean, I'm picking up fire truck vibes here, of course, but we're here to talk about water supply and water delivery. So what was going on at this evolution?
Yeah. So thanks again for having us. It's an honor to be here. And so this class is a class that we did in Hanover County, Virginia, earlier this summer. And the scenario that we got going on here is teaching students how to perform a dual pumping or an intake to intake operation. So if you notice in this picture here, you'll notice that the engine 417 is hooked with their intake going to the intake of that Seagrave in front of it. And they are essentially sharing water from a source. You'll see the supply line that's going between them. That's actually going into that Seagrave, engine 420. They're receiving water from an engine that's down at the hydrant that's actually pumping to engine 420. And engine 417 is now able to share the residual water that engine 420 is not using and flow whatever it needs to flow. What you can't see in this picture is we eventually built this system out a little bit further, and engine 417 actually has another supply line coming in from the same engine that is down at the fire hydrant and pumping to them, engine 401. And it's going into one of the side intakes on this rig. So what we have really created there is a looped system at the fire scene, at our simulated fire scene. So both of these engines are able to share the water that is being pumped from the hydrant. Students were able to, in this configuration, achieve a flow of around 2,000 gallons a minute. Engine 401 at the hydrant was heavy hooked and pumping through parallel supply lines to these two rigs. One line was going into 417. The other line was going into 420. And then both rigs were hooked intake to intake to create this looped system. And the major advantage to this and the takeaway here is that both of these rigs at our fire scene, they had the same residual intake pressures. So they were both sitting at the same intake pressures, flowing whatever they were flowing individually.
Is that because of like an equalization between the two trucks?
Essentially, yeah. So the intake sides of the pump essentially become one big intake manifold, and it is an equalization because both rigs are receiving water on one end, and it's equalized through the other end. The way I like to think about this for folks that have experience with two-stage pumps, this is essentially a two-stage pump in the volume position. So in volume in a two-stage pump, both impellers receive water from the intake side of the pump, and then they discharge it to a common discharge. We're doing the same thing here. We're just using two pumpers to do it. Right? We've created one really big two-stage pump in the volume position. And the major advantage here is that by doing it this way, by sharing water intake to intake, it allows us to have full control of our throttle. So engine 417 here can manipulate their throttle, and so can engine 420. That Seagrave there can manipulate their throttle. One rig isn't really high pumping their lines, and one rig isn't sitting at idle. We can kind of balance the workload between these two rigs at the fire scene.
Was 417 flowing as well?
Yes. Yeah. I didn't capture it in this picture, but 417 has a couple ground monitors and a deck gun going as well. The total flow between each rig when we were finally said and done was about 2,000 gallons a minute.
So the evolution or the scenario was a master stream operation with the objective of trying to, of demonstrating, how, hooking up the two intakes would work.
Correct. And really what we started the evolution with earlier that day is we went to this fire hydrant and we heavy hooked to the hydrant and just flowed as much water as we could just off of that hydrant. And to my recollection, it was about 2,500 gallons a minute that we were able easily to get off that single hydrant. So we knew the hydrant was strong. And what I like to do in my classes when we're in the field is we'll show what a hydrant can do. But I haven't been very fortunate in my experiences where I have a fire that is right next to that super strong hydrant. More times than not, that strong hydrant is several hundred foot away from where my problem is. So what this evolution here is doing is it's showing students this is how you can get water from that really strong hydrant that is a couple hundred foot away and pump it to my fire scene, and how these two engines, engine 417 and engine 420, operating as attack pieces at that fire scene, can actually utilize that water from that hydrant down below several hundred foot away. And again, the key there is what you cannot see is engine 401 is down at that hydrant and pumping that hydrant.
Is engine 401 connected directly to the hydrant?
Yep.
Or is okay? So no valve in use there.
So,
There's
no four-way valve because this fire department they don't run the four-way valve, so we elected not to use it. But they are tied directly into that hydrant. And actually, what we were showing there at that end, we were showing pressure-rated hard sleeve. So the hard sleeve that we used in that scenario was designed and rated to be used on a hydrant and under positive pressure. And the major advantage there is it completely dropped the friction loss between the hydrant and the pumper, much bigger hose, and it doesn't require any pressure to remain charged. So we were pretty much getting a direct shot, heavy hooked off that thing and using pressure rated sleeve. We ran out of horsepower in the engine of the rig before we ran out of water. It was a good problem to have.
I'm just curious. Was it a 6-inch hard sleeve, and was it going directly to the pump?
It was
not through any front intake or anything like that.
Nope, 6-inch hard sleeve coming off the steamer port, going into the driver's side intake.
One thing I wanted to bring up real quick, and I'm sorry, Bill, if you've been trying to jump in. I know I've been asking a lot of questions, but one of the things about this podcast as we've been doing it is there have been a lot of, and we're probably going to get into it a bit more here, a lot of rural water delivery podcasts that we've done. And this is obviously something where this could be rural, but it's a hydranted area. So, we're also, demonstrating here, how we can work without needing to go find a source of water source of water somewhere. Also, I did want to mention that if you are listening to this on one of our platforms, like a Spotify or something like that, this is also going to be on our YouTube channel, and it will be streaming on our Facebook page. So you will be able to see these pictures as we talk about them. Bill, did you have anything you wanted to ask Andy about this one, or any comments on what you're looking at before we get to your first one?
Yeah, a question I would have for the group to understand is, and Andy, you can answer this: if 417 was drafting, would they be able to do the same setup?
Yeah, so that's a great point, right? So like in this picture here, it's hard to tell and hard to see, but what I want folks to understand is that this configuration is not limited. Intake to intake operations are not limited just to pressurized water or hydrant operations, right? So it doesn't really matter that both of these engines are being supplied by engine 401 that is hooked to a hydrant and pumping to them. Engine 401 could be down drafting out of dump tanks, and both of these engines could be up at the driveway sharing water intake to intake. The key here is that it's pressurized on their intake sides. Now, I do get a lot of questions, and people will ask me, can you do an intake to intake operation from a draft? Meaning, if 417 was drafting out of a tank, could 420, the Seagrave, come up, hook hard sleeve to their intake, and draft through 417? I have done that before. It is possible. But in my experience, the only times where that's been really advantageous were unique situations where the pumper had an abundance of intakes. The rig that we were using actually had 5 intakes where it was super advantageous. 2 large intakes on the on the officer side, a front intake, and then a side intake, and it also had a rear intake. So the rig was more of an industrial rig that we were able to draft through the first one and have another rig over there. That's not something that I do too often. But to kind of go back to like what Bill was saying, as long it doesn't matter, the rig at the source can be drafting or can be hooked to a hydrant. It's creating pressure and sending it to these 2 rigs that are sharing the water between them.
Yeah. All right, cool. Let's go on to Bill's first one here. Speaking of drafting, Bill, what are we looking at here?
So what we're looking at here is an engine drafting out of the red dump tank, and what is on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's a hose going from a filling hydrant to these 2 dump tanks. And what we're simulating here is if you have a hydrant that doesn't flow a lot of water, like a filling hydrant per se, this is a filling station setup. So when we have that downtime between tankers arriving to the fill site, we will keep that low flowed hydrant filling those 2 dump tanks up. Those are 2 3,000 gallon dump tanks. So hopefully by the time the first tanker gets there, we can have 6,000 gallons of water on the ground ready to give that tanker that water. We can establish a draft through that engine and recirculate it back through those dump tanks so that we keep that water moving. So when the tanker arrives, we can fill that tanker up at 1,000 gallons a minute instead of the 250 to 300, or even 500 gallons a minute that little hydrant will give you. So there's just one way of setting up, and you can put as many dump tanks down as you need to, depending on how many tankers you have in that drafting operation of that tanker shuttle.
So it's that rig there that is going to supply the tanker.
Yes.
The rig is drafting from the tank to supply the tank. Okay, got it.
Yeah, something I wish I would have stepped back a little bit in the picture, but we had a section of, or 2 sections of 3-inch coming from that engine and filling the tankers as they were coming.
Okay.
Bill, do you guys call that operation anything specific? I know I've heard the term, and I use the term power filling for this type of operation. I mean, essentially, it's an open relay, but we're taking a crappy, cruddy hydrant that doesn't have the volume, and essentially giving it a power upgrade to be able to fill a tanker at our 1,000 gallon per minute fill rate.
Yeah, Andy, we don't have a name for it, but I like that name. What we do is when we have an operator, we'll explain it to them. Go to this location. There's a hydrant. Set your 2 dump tanks down and fill them up, and they get the message.
They get the gist.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I like to tell people when we do this operation, I think of this scenario as, that little hydrant. That's my low paying job, right? I don't make a lot of money, but I can put the money that I do make and put it into a bank account, which are my dump tanks. And over time, I can let that bank account build and make one really big withdrawal. So my withdrawal is me filling that tanker at 1,000 gallons a minute. And then, all right, well, now time is on my side while I'm waiting for the next truck to come, right? My bank account is rebuilding and I can make another big withdrawal.
Right. Something instead of taking 10 minutes to fill that tanker, we can fill it up in a minute. And all it takes is one operator. We can that engine company can drop off its personnel and then go to the fill site with that one operator. And it doesn't take away from the fire scene other than one person.
Yeah, 100%. I love it.
That's the key. That's what Bill always brings up. Make sure whatever you're doing, it can be done by one person, right?
I try to.
Again, is this something just to bring up your question from before? Is this something you could do if you were drafting versus having just a low flow hydrant?
Yeah, you sure can. If we're drafting from a static water source like a pond or a lake, we're just going to recirculate that water back into the pond, and there's plenty of water there. But yes, when we have a lake or a pond closer to the area, we send that engine with that one firefighter, the operator, to set that up and just recirculate that water back into the static water source. And the reason we keep that water moving is because when you're stopping and you're waiting for the next tanker to arrive, all it takes is a pinhole of a leak for that to, you lose your prime, and then now you got to take the time to get your prime when that tanker arrives. We want to keep that water moving. And that way, when the tanker shows up, we can start giving them water. We can shut down that recirculation and fill them at 1,000 gallons a minute or more.
Yeah, something that I like to go along with that question, Chris, is, a lot of times I will show this type of operation or the same concept when I'm using portable pumps, or maybe I have a brush truck that can actually access the water source that my pumper can't reach. Well, I can have my little portable pump or my brush truck drafting out of the source and filling this dump tank, right? Filling this dump tank up by the street where the Class A pumper can actually draft and fill our tankers. It's the same concept. The only difference is I'm using the portable pump to take water from that static source to fill the dump tank, as opposed to using the low flow hydrant.
All righty. So let's see. So let's go to another one from Andy here. It looks like a bit of hose in the street here. Again, I'm guessing there might be some hydrant work being done here, Andy. I'm not sure. First time I'm really taking a hard look at the picture. What's going on here?
Yeah, so this is in Lebanon and Abingdon, Virginia. This was later this year. And we were doing an advanced hydrant operations class. And the scenario was we were using a fire hydrant that had a 2,000 gallon per minute capable flow. All right. And we had shown that we can get 2,000 GPM, no problem, this, that, and the other. The problem that we ran into is the Lebanon Fire Department. These guys, great firemen, aggressive firemen, but all they have in terms of supply line is 3-inch hose. They are not in LDH because most of what they do for the majority of their operations is rural water, but they do have the occasional hydrant scenario, this, that, and the other. And Abingdon is kind of a mix as well. They have some 5-inch on their frontline pieces, but the reserve engine that's down at our fire scene has 3-inch. So the scenario was, okay, we know that we can get 2,000 gallons a minute out of our hydrant, but now we got to get it down the street using only what you guys have. And in order to do that, we were showing folks how to lay and how to do a parallel supply line operation. So what you see here is you have 4 separate 3-inch lines going from Lebanon's engine, engine 32, all the way down to the fire scene. And 2 of those lines are going into that Abingdon pumper. The other 2 lines are going into that tower ladder. And you guessed it, those 2 rigs are hooked intake to intake. So we're creating our above ground loop down at our fire scene. But what we're doing here is we're moving that volume using multiple 3-inch lines. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people, and the guys in Lebanon were saying, should we invest in going into large diameter hose or this, that, and the other? And I tell a lot of rural fire departments, you're not necessarily wrong for being in 3-inch hose or some departments using 3.5, right? You have LDH if you know how to use it. And that's essentially what we're doing here, because hydraulically speaking, 2 3-inch lines is the hydraulic equivalent of a single 4-inch supply line. Well, we have 4 3-inch lines, and I know that 2 4s equal a 6. So that means 4 3s equal 1 6-inch supply line. So really what these guys did here is they made a 6-inch supply line with the 3-inch hose that they have available to them. So right here in this operation, they're moving 2,000 gallons a minute at a relatively low pump discharge pressure on engine 32. The pump discharge pressure is low, but the engine RPMs were very high in order to move that volume through the pump. But they were able to get to it, right? They're flowing 1,000 gallons a minute out of the tower ladder's bucket, and they're flowing 1,000 out of the deck gun on the engine at our peak. When we were there, we put a pressure gauge on the hydrant, and we were sitting right about 20 pounds on the hydrant at 2,000 gallons a minute. So what we ended up doing is, just to make the water department a little happier, we gated our flow back and sustained an easy 1,800 between those 2 rigs at our fire scene. And now what you can't see in this picture is the rig is hooked up to the hydrant using large diameter hose. So what we told these guys when we were there, if you're going to invest in large diameter hose and you have a tight budget, the first thing you want to invest in is short pony lengths to be able to get the water from the hydrant into your rig. You can still use 3-inch to get water from rig to fire scene. It just means you're going to be putting more hose on the ground for larger flows. And I mean, really, this picture is no different than what we were seeing in, the 60s and the 70s before large diameter hose really took off and was super popular, right? Our forefathers knew this. They were getting flows through this hose. They just had to put more hose on the ground to do it.
I think the key there too is what they were doing right here. They were drilling.
Yeah.
So it's just fine that you're still using 3-inch as long as you drill on it and know how to get the flows you're going to be looking for. It is what it is. But like you said, of course, going with the LDH route to get the from the hydrant to the truck. I mean, when you think about 3-inch too, mathematically, it's easier to figure out that the friction loss for that than when you get into like the longer equations, because unless they've changed it, and I could be wrong, is it still quantity squared?
That's right.
Okay, then that's a much easier way to do it than you're thinking of the parentheses and dividing by 32 and the whole thing. But again, if you've already done it and you know what you're doing, hopefully there's something on the truck that will or on the pumper that will tell you what you need to be doing. Bill, anything on this one?
The only thing I was going to add to this is if you only had one apparatus down there, and let's say it was a 2,000 GPM pump, and you wanted to get those 4 3-inch sections of hose into that apparatus, most apparatus comes with 1, 2.5 on each side of the pump panel. But you can also take a threaded 6-inch or even a Storz to double female fitting to put on your large intake to add those other two into that pump as well.
Yeah, and actually that's what we ended up doing on one of the intakes on that tower ladder.
Okay.
Because that truck was unique in that it only had one auxiliary 2.5 going in on the driver's side. So we adapted it to receive the other one on the officer side.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And one thing that I want to note real quick on this engine from Abingdon, these guys, because they're used to using 3-inch on that rig, if you look real close, you can note that they had set up their hose bed in a split bed configuration. So when we started the day off before we put all this hose on the ground, the first scenario, that engine just laid duals, right? It dropped 2 3s and just forward laid to our fire scene while engine 32 stayed at the hydrant.
I'm going to date myself here, but you start talking about laying duals, and I think of emergency. I think of engine 51, the whole thing. So, Bill, I think this next one kind of takes us back. We discussed this, I believe, in a few podcasts ago. But let's talk about this one. This is more on the equipment side.
Yeah, this is just more or less setting your apparatus up for the success that you're going to be operating in. And what we're looking at there is a low profile strainer, and it's already attached to the hard suction. So when the operator shows up, they do not have to worry about trying to attach it. There is a rear intake on this apparatus. And what I did is I ordered 20 feet of 1 3/4. That way it can be rolled up and pushed inside that compartment. And when the operator shows up, they can pull that out already attached to the hard suction, and then put that to the intake. And then there's a discharge in the back of that apparatus as well. We hook up that for a pressurized prime. And instead of having to rely on our primer all the time, we can pressurize prime it, and everything's already hooked up together. There's nothing to hook up other than the intake, or that the hard sleeve to the intake, and that section of 1 3/4 right there to the discharge, and they're ready to go.
Talk about what you mean by pressurized prime real quick, just in case there are some who aren't familiar with the term.
Yes, some people call it pressurized prime, and some people call it jet siphoning. It's the same concept as when we're jet siphoning from water from one tank into another, like we showed in my first picture there. But we're going to use it to get the water pressurized and pushed into the intake instead of having to actually touch the primer to create that vacuum. So what we'll do is you hook up your intake, make sure we want everything to be airtight still, just in case, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Hook that up, and then you open up your discharge, and then that jet siphon device that's on that low profile strainer will force the water up to the intake. And before I open up the intake, I want to bleed off as much air as possible, hopefully all of it, before I open up that intake slowly, to allow that water into your pump.
All right. Let's see here. So we'll go to Andy's next one here. Again, we're looking at a hydrant. We're looking at hose in the street. One thing I did glance at this one when I was loading it in here, and the one thing that I wanted to mention, it was something that we brought up a while back, which was, and this is a great looking rig, but you can tell that it is on the older side. It's not, it's not something that rolled off the line, 5 years ago. This is probably in the 15 to 20 range. Just looking at it, that's what I'm guessing. I don't know.
If my memory serves me right, this is a 90s model pumper. And these guys in Norton have taken fantastic care of this rig. Go ahead.
Well, it's just, like what the things that we're talking about whenever we've talked about whatever we've talked about during these podcasts, where we're not talking about having to have the newest, most up-to-date everything in order to achieve the flows that we're trying to achieve, and in order to implement some of the tactics that you both have talked about.
Yeah, and that's actually why I picked this picture, because what was going on in this scenario, we were teaching at the Wise County, Virginia Regional School. We were invited by the Virginia Department of Fire Programs to teach at this conference, and this scenario we're doing it was our final scenario. We're trying to build an above ground loop, and this engine is pumping water down to a tower ladder at the other end through a couple 100 foot of 5-inch, all that good stuff. But what was really interesting, we knew previously to starting this drill, this was a 1500 GPM plus hydrant that we were using. And this rig being a little bit older, this rig was purchased prior to the fire department investing in large diameter hose. So all the discharges on the rig at the time, they were all 2.5-inch discharges because they were using 2.5 or 3-inch supply line at the time. Well, the department eventually made the switch over to large diameter hose, but they had this rig that didn't have large diameter discharge plumbing. So what the department did is what a lot of fire departments do is they simply took a 2.5-inch to 5-inch Storts adapter and put it on one of their discharges. And while that achieves what, I'll be able to pump a 5-inch, the problem is, and what a lot of people don't realize, is there is a tremendous amount of internal loss in the plumbing when I'm trying to flow the volumes of water that 4 and 5 inch is capable of flowing. According to the standard, NFPA 1900 now, 1901 then, only required that 2.5-inch discharge have to be able to flow 250 gallons per minute, which is way less than what 5-inch is capable of moving. So what we did in this scenario, what we showed this department, because they had the tools, they already had it with them, because they do some rural water too. We simply took a clappered Siamese and connected it to the 5-inch. And instead of trying to take that 5-inch and connect it to one discharge that was internally plumbed to 2.5 inches in diameter, we used two 2.5-inch discharges on this pumper to feed into that Siamese and then feed into that 5-inch going down the street. And what that did is it dramatically reduced the workload on this rig because we've minimized the friction within the pump itself. And the way you know that's working is your master discharge gauge and your individual line gauges will be much, much closer to reading one another. If we had tried to jam all that water through that one discharge, we would have had much wider ranges between the master discharge gauge and the individual line gauge, indicating to us that we are working a lot harder. There's a lot of friction within the pump. The pump has to work a lot harder to get to the pump pressure and the volume that's needed on that discharge, and the motor's at a very high engine RPM. What this rig was able to do as well, you can see that they are double tapping the hydrant. They have a 6-inch supply line coming off the steamer port and a 5-inch supply line coming off the side port going into the officer side intake. So what they were able to do is get as much water into this rig to bring their residual intake pressure as high as possible, and therefore using multiple discharges on the outlet side, reduce friction in the truck so the engine RPMs aren't screaming to try and move big water down the other end.
In this picture, the yellow line to the back, is that LDH?
Yes, that's 5-inch.
Okay. And so the two green lines coming off are supplying that single line of 5-inch.
Correct. Yeah, those two green lines are 3-inch supply lines going to the clappered Siamese that's connected to the 5-inch. So really, if we look at this hydraulically, right, those two 3-inch lines hooked to that rig, essentially I have a 4-inch large diameter hose coming off my discharges on the rig going 50 feet and being plugged into a 5-inch going the rest of the way.
We had a similar setup with our 81 LaFrance. Again, purchased before we ran with LDH, and in order to we run HUMAT valves. So in order to get the water into the truck and back out again, it was 2-3 inches coming off of that. That was that went to a Y.
Yep.
It was basically backwards, really, when you think about it. That fed the Storz connection. I'm guessing that's the exact same type of adapter you're talking about, or Y that you're talking about.
Exactly. Yep.
Bill, anything you wanted to talk about on this one? Any observations there besides the fact that it's a great looking rig?
It is a great looking rig. This reminds me a lot of the roll hitch, except that, with a hydrant. The roll hitch looks a lot like this when it's finished, except there's a dump tank somewhere in that process, and they're pushing that forward to the fire scene.
I'm glad you picked this one, Andy, because it really does illustrate pretty well, how an older rig can achieve the flows that we're trying to do here. It doesn't have to be, because now that I'm bringing that up, what size pump was on there?
If I remember correctly, it was a 1,500 gallon per minute pump.
Okay.
And
I would have to look back at my pictures, but I'm fairly certain it was a 1,500 GPM pump.
Like Andy mentioned before, if they would have took a fitting and put it on that 2.5 from 2.5 to Storz and did the 5-inch, they wouldn't flow as much water as they can in this scenario here, because they still have to overcome that 2.5 instead of these two.
Yeah, and honestly, up until this class, there were guys from Norton in the class, and they're like, "Yeah, we that's how we normally do it. We hook the 5-inch right to this one discharge, but we have this clappered Siamese because we do the roll hitch. It's in this compartment, right? Like, so we didn't even think to do it this way, right? They already had the stuff, and this kind of highlights, some of the things that I know we talk about in this podcast, like Chris, you had mentioned before, is fairly heavy on the rural water stuff, but the tools that we use in rural water aren't just exclusively for rural water, right? Clappered Siameses are super advantageous in the urban setting to do stuff like this, right? It's just water delivery. It doesn't really necessarily matter that it's in the urban environment or the suburban environment. The tools can be used in both.
And speaking of tools, and then the rural side of things, we're going to go back to one that has a portable tank. Bill, what was the evolution going on here?
Okay, so we were demonstrating for the times that you have a primer that's just not very strong, and how can we take that and make it easier for that primer? And what we did here is we pushed that 6-inch hard sleeve through the drain of that dump tank. And when we put water on it, the pressure of that from that water around that sleeve will seal up a lot of that from leaking. So it won't leak out the actual drain itself. And you can also take a bungee cord or a ratchet strap and tighten it up a little bit more if you needed to. But this truck here that's actually doing the priming is not didn't have the problem with the primer. We were just showing this so that when this department actually had an apparatus that was out of service at the time of the training, they mentioned that they could not get that to go over the lip of that dump tank. The water would come up to it, but just couldn't get over that top. And by lowering that hard sleeve, it made it a lot easier. It took a lot more air out of that sleeve for that primer to not have to work as hard to get that draft.
I'm looking at this, and so you're saying, and again, I'm not a rural guy, I'm not a portable tank guy, so I don't always know. So what this is going through is the drain for the tank.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. You take the drain.
How difficult is it to break that down at the end?
At the end,
I guess not. It wouldn't make too much of it because it's probably not going to have a lot of water in it anyway.
Yeah, a lot of dump tanks nowadays, and this one had the same. They had two drains, so we drain the water from the other drain, or you can disconnect the hard sleeve from the pump and just set it on the ground, and it would drain out that way. And then then you just disconnect everything and just pull the hard sleeve out.
I love it. I love this trick. The one thing that I love that you have in this, Bill, is and it's so critically important that drain sleeve be on the inside.
Yes.
right? Because like Bill said, it seals everything. I have seen folks try and do this, and it will work, but you got to work a lot harder with the drain sleeve on the outside, and they'll shove the hard sleeve through and have the drain sleeve on the outside. Well, now water's working against you because the water's going to want to come around and blow out, right? So you have to use rope and ratchet straps and all kinds of stuff to tighten it down so it doesn't blow out. But this, by going inside, man, the water's doing the work for you.
Yeah, we did not put a bungee cord on this one for the picture, and very, very minimal leak. You'd be surprised at how, as you can look, if you look real close in there, you can see that sleeve it's tight up against that.
Yeah, you can see the ribs of the hard sleeve.
Yep.
Is that a common, Andy, you said you love this trick. Is that a common thing that people are up against a lot? I guess it's just, and see, like something like this, to me, it's like, okay, we know the truck, the primer it's just not a strong enough primer, but could there be something like, would you also use this if the primer's malfunctioned for some reason?
Or so sometimes I use this trick if it's not even a primer issue. It might be a placement issue, meaning maybe I can't position the rig like Bill has it in this picture, whereas I have dump tank and then immediately adjacent to it I have the pumper. Maybe because of the space requirements and whatever I'm dealing with, maybe my dump tank has to be in front of the engine, right? So if the rig is in front of the engine and I only have 20 feet of sleeve available, 2 sections of sleeve, I might not have enough hard sleeve to go up over and then back down into the dump tank and keep the strainer down low in the tank. The strainer might want to keep popping up. But if I run it through the drain sleeve, the strainer doesn't have to waste length going up and then back down in the dump tank, and it'll just sit right on the bottom. So that's another option for doing this technique.
Another thing that this technique works really well for is, let's say we don't want to put the dump tank right next to the apparatus. It might be 50, even maybe close to 100 feet away, as long as it's not going vertical. If it's going horizontal, that water will come down that hard sleeve and take away all the air, or it takes up a lot of the space on the air that you have to overcome with that primer. So instead of pulling 50 feet of air, we're only going to be pulling 5 or 10 at the most.
Got it. All right, cool, Andy. This next one looks like we're looking at master streams again. So what, I guess, what was the objective of this evolution, and what was going on?
So this was in Rockingham County, Virginia, at their regional school back in April of this year. And the folks there, they gave us fantastic logistical support. We were doing a class where we were focusing. We did a day of rural water work, and then we did a day of hydrant work. And in this beautiful neighborhood that we're in, where they gave us the hydrants to use, these things were monsters. I mean, solid monster hydrants. They had pressure and volume. The scenario that we did in the prior to what you see right here, we were flowing about 4,000 gallons a minute off of 2 hydrants, no problem. And we still had 60 pounds of residual intake pressure. Again, we ran out of horsepower on our rigs. But what we did starting out that day, we got to this cul-de-sac where everybody met, and I told the students, I said, all right, your objective for the day is to fill that retention pond. That retention pond was dry, bone dry when we started that day. And by the end of the day, the students had filled it to that depth. And as their final scenario, to kind of tie some of the other things that we did earlier or the day before, I told them, all right, well, you put the water in there. Now you got to go get it back out. So they had to use the turbo drafts because the source was too far away. And I know it's a panoramic, so you can't really see how we were set. But they used 2 turbo drafts to go into that retention pond and then essentially pump the water from the retention pond up to this dump tank and then drafted, and then they were just putting it back in to show that they could make use of that water. But essentially, this is kind of like what we were talking about before with Bill's weak hydrant scenario, except I'm using 2 turbo drafts as my weak hydrant. Now, granted, the turbo drafts can move more than that weak hydrant. The 2 turbos that we are using in this example, they're moving enough water to this tank where we were able to sustain 1,000 gallons per minute out of the dump tank. And what you see here is that yellow engine from Grotto's. They are powering the turbo drafts. They're pumping to the turbo drafts, and water's coming back up and filling the tank. And that engine is drafting out of that tank to maintain the process. So it's just one big recirculator. And then this other engine here that we're on top of, they're drafting out of the tank and then pumping 1,000 gallons a minute out of their gun. So it was a cool exercise. And my favorite part was, taking a retention pond that was dry when we started and filling it up to where we could use it by the end of the day.
Now here, were you guys still hooked up to a hydrant at this point?
Nope, we're not
so
using
you
a
weren't
hydrant
mixing the municipal and okay.
Yeah. So now all that water that's in that pond came from the hydrants earlier in the day, but this was, hey, we were done with the hydrant side of the scenarios for the day, and I wanted to throw them a little bit of a curveball to see how they could do as a final scenario because they thought they were done with drafting. So we tested their skills.
Nice. Bill, anything on that one?
I love that scenario. That's a great training ground scenario to do at your stations. If you live in the rural communities, this is a good one to have.
Well, and what was important for these guys, especially in Rockingham County, to learn and see is, right, well, they know that there's a retention pond there, and in these neighborhoods they have retention ponds. And depending on the time of year, if that pond is full and they happen to have a failure of their hydrants in this neighborhood, this house that's right over here, yeah, there's a hydrant at the end of the cul-de-sac, but if the hydrant's dead and that pond is full, they still have water, right? Mm-hmm. They can still use that water for something.
All right, let's go to Bill's next one here, and we're looking at some tank work again.
Yeah, more tank work. This is a way of equalizing 2 tanks. So if you have an apparatus or even 2 drafting out of multiple tanks, and we know when we jet siphon from one tank to another, we're robbing from our pump capacity. And if this is one technique that you can use to where you don't necessarily have to rob that water to jet siphon, moving water from one to the next, as long as you have enough tankers to keep both of these this tank full, the water will equalize. And just like when the previous picture, the water from those tanks will create that seal around that hard sleeve, and you'll have, like I say, if those tanks are halfway full, they're both going to be halfway. And instead of only having a 3,000 gallon dump tank, now you have a 6,000 or close to 6,000.
And these are tricks. I mean, are these things like when you go through a rural pump school, is this stuff that they show you how to do, or is this stuff that you just kind of glean over time as some shortcuts, or how to with something like this? I mean, again, like with the other one I had asked Andy about, I mean, is this a common thing that you do, or no?
No, it's not common at all. But the scenario could arise where, like I say, if you have a 1,500 GPM pump and the fire scene's requiring close to that, you're not going to be able to jet siphon your water and still be able to supply them at the same time. So, gotcha. And this is a bunch of old firefighters that experimented, and we've experimented back and forth. And honestly, I've seen this at FDIC a few times, through.
Could you daisy chain a bunch of these? I mean, could you go up to 9 if you wanted to? And
as long as you got enough tankers to keep them full. But remember, like when we jet siphon from one tank to another, we can get a lot more water out of that second tank over there. This is all going to be equalized. So it may become a disadvantage over time. If you're trying to if you're running short on water, you'll have water in that yellow tank per se. If I was to try and jet siphon that water over to the red where the truck is priming from, it's going to leak right back over to the yellow. So it's going to be equalized. So you need to have enough tankers to keep those full enough.
Yeah, Bill hit the nail on the head there. This is a great trick, but the thing that I have seen and run into is I could potentially, if these are 3,000 gallon tanks, so I have 6,000 gallons worth of area, but I may get the levels so low that I may have 1,000 gallons of water usable to me, but it's over such a large area that I'm getting whirlpools and now I can't use it.
Right.
Whereas if I jet siphon from this tank to the other, I can only focus on keeping 3,000 gallon tanks areas worth full, right? I can better use that. But like Bill said, then I got to use pump capacity for the jet siphon. Where I like to use this trick is, let's say I have a 3-tank system and I have an engine drafting out of the primary tank, but I don't have enough hard sleeve to go and transfer from tank 3 over top of tank 2 into tank 1. I can tie tank 2 and 3 together as my collection pond and then just use one jet siphon to move it to tank 1. And try and keep tank 1 as full as possible all the time. And I don't really care if tanks 2 and 3 get low where it's going to be a problem where I can't draft.
And dump tank manufacturers, they actually make this without having to use the hard sleeve. If you go to one of the trade shows, you can take a look. They'll usually have them up there, and it's a Storz fitting. You set them side by side and click in a Storz fitting, and then you're basically getting the same thing.
One thing I learned the hard way with this is we had a section of hose with an old low-level strainer that we couldn't get off. I think they welded it to the hard sleeve. We just could not get this thing off. And we ended up doing this because we had multiple tanks in a training scenario. And we just said, you know what, we'll use that and run it as the transfer because we were running out of trucks and jet siphons and everything. So it worked in that aspect. Well, for whatever reason, that low-level strainer, it affected the equilibrium. It would not transfer right. So that one side remained higher than the other side, and it didn't transfer right. My advice would be to use wide open pipe like Bill has here. So that way it truly will be equal.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's go to this will be the last one from Andy, and then we have a couple more from Bill after this. But Andy, this looks, this, I don't know if you're looking at turbo drafts here or what's going on. What I see, it looks like it's going through the crew cab there. So this is an interesting one.
So this is in Southern Pines, North Carolina. We actually just did this class a couple weeks ago. Great group of guys, solid work done by all. But this was one of their final scenarios that we did at the end of the class. And we were doing a shuttle operation. And this is down at the fill site. So engine 822 was dispatched and assigned to be the fill site pumper. And we had a route that was, I think it was a 1.5 mile round trip, or maybe 2 miles round trip. But anyway, this rig is down at our fill site, and we're using a Beaver Creek as our fill site. So engine 822, originally positioned, used 2 sections of hard sleeve and a strainer to establish their initial prime going into their driver's side intake. And then they are using their rear discharge to fill tankers at the top of the street. Then they later built out the system to perform a twin tube draft, so that way they could get more water into the truck and reduce the workload, but also build in a layer of redundancy in case a strainer got clogged. And they ran that hard sleeve through the cab of the truck and connected it to the officer side intake. to be able to establish this twin tube. Now, a lot of people will look at this and say, man, you're going through the cab, like that's all wild. What the hell is going on there? Why not go underneath the truck? And there's a reason I don't like going underneath the truck when I'm doing something like this, and it has to do with the heat from the exhaust. If I'm not careful, that heat from the exhaust can radiate down, and it can destroy my hard sleeve. It can actually melt. I've had hard sleeve actually get warm enough where they collapse just like straws, and that is going to really jack up the whole operation. By going through the cab here, I eliminate all of that. I eliminate the heat. I eliminate I'm really protecting my hard sleeve, and I'm able to reach the other side of the rig. But what I really like about this truck, and I want to point out, it's hard to tell if you don't know the truck, but that rear discharge that we're using to fill tankers, Southern Pines, they did something really unique with their rig. And all of their engines in their fleet are set up this way. That rear discharge is plumbed to be either a rear discharge or a rear intake. So the plumbing goes through the truck, and it will go, there's actually a portion on the discharge side of the pump that comes out and ties into it with a discharge valve. And then there's a portion that goes to the intake side of the pump with an intake valve. So depending on what these guys are trying to do, they can use that attachment as either an intake or a discharge. In this scenario, it worked really well for them to use it as a discharge, right? Because they're filling tankers. The hose came right off the back. The tankers are right at the intersection a couple 100 foot away, and they're able to fill no problem. They actually have what you can't see in this picture. We have a manifold on the ground, and that 5 inches going into the manifold to fill the tankers. But in another scenario later or earlier in the week, we were using that rear intake as an intake, right? So they were drafting off that rear intake, and they did it because a lot of times they run an urban rural mix. So there can be times like this where they're filling tankers, but there can be other times where they pull into a driveway and have to draft out of a dump tank. So they can just set a dump tank right behind the rig, pull a draft right off the rig with one section of hard sleeve and a low-level strainer and go to work. So it's a really cool idea. It's something I really like. I know the next pumper that I build, I'm definitely going to be stealing that idea and putting it on my next pumper. It worked great. So
that's what we do in the fire service. We steal from each other all the time, and it usually works out pretty well. I do have a question. Now, this is going to, I do this at the risk of really, really making myself look bad here. But it's just something that I've never had the prime a truck. I think I told you guys before, except during training. In order to get like the Pump 1 or the Pump 2 certification, I have not had to demonstrate the skill of priming the pump. But I'm just curious, when you build this system out the way that you did, first of all, I'm guessing there's got to be an intake valve of some sort on the driver's side intake. But second of all, what do you do about getting the water?
Say that again.
What do you do about getting the water out of the creek and into that other intake?
Yeah. So what's really important about this setup, and again, all of these pictures, you're seeing the final product, right? What would have been better if I could figure out a way to do it would be to do a time lapse of how this was built. And if we were to watch a time lapse video of how this was built, we would see that the engine pulled up. The first intake was primed, and the driver elected to use a technique that we call burp drafting to get the prime, to simulate that the primer doesn't work. So he got the prime within less than 20 seconds, burp drafting through this hard sleeve configuration on the driver's side. And then they started filling tankers off the back because a rig had showed up and they're ready to fill. So while they're filling that, right, and doing their thing, or filling that first tanker, that operator and a helper, they're assembling hard sleeve to expand the system for a twin tube draft. So they're building the hard sleeve, they're putting it through the cab, all while this pumper is set and filling tankers and doing its thing. Then when they were ready, because of the strainer they elected to use, they didn't have a low-level strainer available to them with the jet siphon attachment, so they couldn't pressurize prime like Bill was talking. That would be the ideal option for getting the second intake. Just charge that 1 3/4, use that Venturi to have that water come up that hard sleeve and go in through the cab and go into the other intake. Well, they didn't have that. They had a barrel strainer and a box strainer. Neither of them had a jet siphon. So what the operator had to do was wait for a break in the fill and close the first intake. And what that essentially did was maintain the prime on that driver's side intake right there. It's no different than taking your thumb and putting it over a straw in a drink and pulling it out of the water. It maintains that prime. And then the operator just simply burp drafted the second intake. And once he got that prime, he reopened the initial intake, and now he had twice the amount of water entering the pump, and he was actually able to increase his fill rate. We were crushing and filling at more than 1,000 gallons a minute. So in this scenario, we had 5 tankers in our shuttle route. They were flowing 1,000 gallons a minute down at our fire scene, 2-mile round trip, and we had no problems keeping up.
And so there would be an interruption for just a short period of time of water coming into the truck. So that's not a point, you want to do that in between fills.
Correct. If this engine wasn't the fill site engine, maybe this is an engine doing something like this at a dump site, right? This is where using that pressurized prime would be the better option, because I could get that second intake primed without interrupting because I'm using that other strainer. And that strainer is better suited for a dump tank rather than this creek. So again, this is just a timing thing. Hey, we got 3 minutes between these 2 tankers showing up. Let's go ahead and get this other intake primed real quick.
Gotcha. All right, Bill, you're up. These last 2 are both yours. Let's take a look at this first one.
This scenario is almost identical to what Andy was just talking about with the last one. Was the dual intakes being primed. What we were doing here in this scenario was supplying a ladder truck, and we started off with the front intake, and we knew that we could only get around 750 to 800 gallons a minute out of that front intake with that strainer. And we wanted to get more than that, so we added a second tube, and we did exactly like what Andy just talked about. We with that ladder truck flowing water, we were able to slowly burp draft. But what we noticed when we're doing that burp draft is you get a little bit interruption. That stream on that ladder truck wasn't as fine as it was. When we start the burp draft, you get the needle moving back and forth, and you get a lot of air coming into your pump. So just understand, if you got crews inside trying to do that, trying to fight fire, a second intake may need to wait until we can get that time where we can interrupt that flow.
What are the strainers you're using there? Are those what type of
those? Those are floating strainers. That's actually a barrel strainer with a float on it. Instead of using a lot of times people use a barrel strainer and put an empty bucket over top of it, or an empty foam bucket. These are actual built fabricated strainers to just sit on top of the water. So it's a full barrel strainer.
And then let's see here. I think this is probably one of your favorite things to talk about. I think when we do these. Here's the last one. What are we looking at here?
So we're looking at a vacuum tanker here, and this is just an example of what you can do with a vacuum tanker. And the guys that produce the vacuum tankers, or they manufacture, they call this the suck and dump. That's just good old boys, and this is what they call it. And so I've mentioned before, vacuum tankers are not designed to use that vacuum and push water at the same time. But what you can do is the theory of a suck and dump. And if you look on the driver's side of that apparatus, that water source could be 100 feet away. In this particular scenario, it was a lot closer. But that could be 100 feet away, and it would fill up at 1,000 gallons a minute and then dump at 1,000 gallons a minute. So what its job is to do is to get that. So we were able to flow 500 gallons a minute off of that one vacuum tanker continuously without ever running out of water, because, like I say, it flows, or it drafts at 1,000 gallons a minute and dumps at 1,000 gallons a minute into those dump tanks. So what you can't see in this picture here is an engine on the other side of that dump tank drafting and flowing the water back into a river. This was down by the Ohio River. This was a class I took. I was actually a student in this class. Jason Estep out of Morrisville, West Virginia. I've mentioned his name before. He was teaching this class, and anytime I can take one of his classes on vacuum tankers, it's well worth it.
Andy, I don't hear you talk about vacuum tankers that much. Have you done much with them or no?
I don't have a lot of experience with them personally. I've sat in Jason's class before at FDIC. It's a great class. I recommend it to anybody that has the opportunity to sit in one of his classes. But I know enough about them to understand how they operate, not enough about them to recommend how to use them.
Yeah. They're not very popular in the southwest Ohio either. They're very popular in the northern part of Ohio. Honestly, until about 10 years ago, I didn't know much about them myself. But I did talk to one of our departments close by, a department I teach for, to get one because of the resources that they have. They don't have a whole lot of hydrants, but they have a lot of streams and a lot of ponds. So the vacuum tanker for them is very beneficial.
Well, as usual, we have covered a tremendous amount of information today. It's been varied, and I thank you guys for going back into your archives there to find some pictures for us to share. Bill, I'm going to start with you though. Based on everything that we talked about today, are there any general takeaways for today? Based on everything that we talked about, whether it's just your pictures and just your experiences or some of the things that Andy talked about too.
Yeah, the one thing I really wanted to mention today is we have plenty of time when that fire apparatus is sitting in the bay to set things up to make it easier for us when we get on that scene. On the scene is not the time to figure things out. It's when that truck is in the bay and doing drills like we've showed here, that's where you figure this out. If you look, I don't think any of our pictures were from a fire scene, probably because we're busy working on the fire scene instead of taking pictures. But we got out, and me and Andy, between Andy and myself, we get out and drill a lot. And like that first picture I showed you where we set that low profile strainer with the jet siphon already hooked up, we took that time by sitting in the bay, setting it up for us to have success when we show up on the fire ground.
Andy, how about you? Takeaways?
Yeah, I can't. Bill hit the nail on the head. I mean, training is critical. A lot of this stuff, the only way you get good at it is to go out and do it. That's the big thing. And I know that you may not be able to put multiple dump tanks or do a full tanker shuttle, every week for drill, but even just sitting down, talking about it and drawing it out on boards and taking that time in the truck house to look over equipment, check your adapters and figure things out. It is time well worth it. Right. It'll be very beneficial to you if you get out and have to do this stuff.
All right. Well, speaking of training, just a reminder again that Bill and Andy will both be teaching at FDIC International 2025 coming up in April. FDIC.com does have the entire classroom list on the site, so go take a look there. and take a look and go see the descriptions of both those classes. In addition, the show plan, the floor plan for the show is up and running there. So get started early. Figure out what classes you're going to take, but also based on just what we've talked about now, take a look at the exhibitor list, take a look at where they are on the floor, and sort of plot your days. It's a big floor, so you definitely want to have kind of a plan of attack for it before you get started. Again, my thanks to Bill and Andy for joining me today. If there are topics, we just recently did a topic that was submitted to us. If there are topics that we haven't hit on yet, either Bill, Andy, and me for water delivery or any of the other podcasts, please let me know. I'm at chris.mcloon@clarionevents.com. As well, all of our podcasts are archived on our website at fireapparatusmagazine.com/podcasts. So again, thanks for another great year of podcasts, guys. We'll be planning January 2025 soon. Again, this has been Chris McClune with Bill Adkins and Andy Soccodato. Have a good one and stay safe. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. For over 20 years, TheFireStore has equipped first responders with trusted gear featuring brands like MSA Carnes for helmets and Seek for thermal imaging cameras. Stay prepared. Visit thefirestore.com today. The Firestore, your trusted safety partner.
United Safety's Valor First Responder solutions are built for those who protect us. With durable, ergonomic seating for fire trucks and ambulances, advanced air purification to reduce airborne risks, and a dependable vehicle brake lock for added safety on the job, we provide solutions that keep first responders ready and protected. Valor First Responder Solutions, designed for the demands of the front